This is Join Us in France, episode 576, 576. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we take a conversational journey through the beauty, culture, and flavors of France. Today I bring you a conversation with Elyse Rivin of Toulouse Guided Walks about Charles de Gaulle, the towering figure who shaped modern France. From his military brilliance in both world wars to his controversial leadership as a president, we dive into his life, legacy, and the sheer force of will that made him a legend. Whether you admire him or question his methods, this episode reveals why de Gaulle remains one of history's most fascinating leaders. Listen now to uncover the man behind the myth. This podcast is fueled by Chocolatine, coffee, and the generosity of listeners like you. You book itinerary consults, take my voice map tours, join the boot camp. Well, not for 2026, but perhaps another time. Hop in my electric car for a day trip around the southwest of France, or chip in on Patreon, and I am so grateful. If you want to keep me going and skip the ads, there's a link for that in the show notes as well. And you'll find everything else at joinusinfrance.com/boutique. And thank you so much. For the magazine part of the podcast, after my chat with Elyse today, I'll discuss New Year's Eve in Paris because I know Paris is a popular place for visitors to enjoy the celebration, and there's a few things you should be aware of. If you're interested in the links and the full episode transcript, you can find those at the page that lists all episodes by month, joinusinfrance.com/episode. And if you'd like a handy summary of the conversation we have on the podcast every week, subscribe to the newsletter at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. It is the best way to stay in the loop. Bonjour, Elyse.
Bonjour, Annie.
We are going to talk about Charles de Gaulle today. We're taking on a big one. So I have to say at the onset, we are going to tell you a little bit about the story of his life, but we are not the historians who specialize in this. So do not crucify us if we get a detail wrong, okay?
if we make a factual mistake somewhere along the way. Right.
Yeah. We're not pretending to be all end all of the history of Charles de Gaulle. But I think both of us have done enough research that we can safely talk about him, at least in general terms. I'll get it started this time with his birth and his family. Very interesting family. But the first thing I want to mention is the name, de Gaulle. Because the Gauls, as you know, are the people who they named the country. La Gaule was the first name that this part of the world was known as before it was known as France. And he was de Gaulle, so a particle, which indicates that he was a nobleman. And he was, but he was not, it was not the noble de robe. It was one of his ancestors got a title in the 1600s, which happened. Not very wealthy people. No, his father was a history teacher and literature teacher. His mother was extremely Catholic, so was pious, yes. His wife was also very pious. As a matter of fact, she ended her life in a convent.
Oh, did she?
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that.
After he died, yeah. So a very kind of traditional family of the north of France. He was born in Lille in 1890, November 22nd, 1890. His mother was Jeanne Maillot de Gaulle, and his father was Henri de Gaulle. He was raised a strict Catholic with a lot of patriotism and French history because his father was a French history teacher. Well, he was a history teacher in general.
In general, and if I understand correctly, there were shades of monarchism still left in the family. Yes, the royalists, as they like to call them.
Royalists, yes. But there were some of the people some of the members of his family wouldn't have minded a good king.
A good king.
Yes.
I suspect after listening to the whole story of his life, that probably rubbed off on him a bit, so.
Yeah, it did. From a young age, he aspired to pursue a military career He was obviously inspired by family discussions of France's defeat in 1870 and the desire to restore French greatness. And I know I've said this a few times on the podcast, and I say this to people when I do guiding in person. The reason why we have so many statues of Joan of Arc in French churches is because of this desire to rekindle the kind of a momentum for French greatness that happened after the defeat of 1870. And there were a lot of groups of people who started to put together funds to buy statues and bring her back. There was a global sentiment of a need for a renewal of patriotism.
National spirit.
National spirit, exactly. He entered the Saint-Cyr Military Academy in 1909.
Which is very prestigious, everyone. That you should all know, if you don't, that this is probably the equivalent of West Point.
Yes, it's very prestigious. He graduated in 1912. His classmates noted him for his intelligence, seriousness, and confidence. A few people said he was aloof, but he was generally very confident. And he liked to write papers, which is really interesting. I don't want to skip around, but we'll get back to his writing in a moment. So he had this deep sense of destiny and mission of France, which was reinforced by his Catholic beliefs. He really believed that France was supposed to be a grand country.
And needed to come back in terms of the world's eyes to be what it had been, of course, in the past. Yeah.
Right. And everybody who knew him says he was serious, confident, and had a very strong will.
And for those of you who have no image of him, he was very tall. This is one of the things, when you see pictures of Charles de Gaulle, he stood well a head taller than everybody else. I actually figured out the conversion from meters to feet because I kept thinking, oh my God, he had to have been the equivalent of 2 meters. He was
not quite.
Not quite. He was basically almost 6'6". And the French, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, were really not that big. So when you see pictures of him with the other, even military, you cannot miss him. He is a head taller than everybody with a very distinctive face.
Correct. He stands out. He married Yvonne de Gaulle in 1920. And this was kind of not quite an arranged marriage, but he actually wrote to his mother. He was very in close contact with his mother his whole life. He wrote to her and she asked him if he would like her to find him a wife. And he said yes. She introduced him to several women and he hit it off with this one and they got married.
I had read that he had actually had a sweetheart who got killed during the bombing of World War I. And that apparently, he was not someone who was particularly social, I guess. And so when that ended, and ended, of course, tragically, I guess he just turned to his mom to find him somebody else,
Yeah, I hadn't heard that story. Maybe the book was so long. It was 45 hours. I'm basing a lot of this on a book that I read. I should tell you the name of it because some of you might be interested. It's called A Certain Idea of France by Julian Jackson. And it's a very long book. I looked for books by French authors, but none of them were on Audible. So I just decided to get that one. Anyway, his wife was an extraordinary woman. They were very faithful to one another throughout their lives. She followed him around, raised their children. They were clearly very much in love. It was a very good kind of arranged marriage. They never looked back. They just enjoyed their lives together. They had a daughter, Anne, who was polyhandicapped. It's not clear to me what all was wrong with her, but she had Down syndrome for sure. And she had other things. She died at age 20. Charles de Gaulle was very close to her. I think parents of handicapped children will testify to this. They're very much attached to their normal children, but particularly to their handicapped children as well, because this is a person that really, truly relies on them always. Correct. And they established Anne de Gaulle Foundation.
And she was the only daughter. He had 2 sons first, and she was the last child.
And Yvonne, his wife, ran the foundation until her death. And she influenced him on many issues, such as the contraception rules for France, because he was very conservative, but she felt that perhaps there was a need for a bit of leeway. They didn't seem to be super fertile, both of them, because they had 3 kids, but his brothers had like 7 or 8, all of them. Big family. They were both very private people, didn't enjoy particularly being in the spotlight. His mother was another big influence on his life, and she was very sharp. She insisted on him getting as much education as possible. And they say that Charles was her favorite child. She believed he was special and had a destiny.
Interesting, because I know that he was the third of 6. What I was reading was that it was his oldest brother, Xavier, who apparently was brilliant at school. Some people in school predicted Xavier would be the one that everybody would remember. And then, of course, it turned out to be Charles.
So that's about all I'm going to tell you about his young years. So he was born in Lille, but he grew up in Paris most of his life and spent a lot of time. He traveled a fair bit, but we might get to that when we talk about his life.
Yeah. So maybe we should start with World War I, since this is a man who made his name in the world by being a military man, a very interesting, unique, and courageous one. He was 25. Obviously, having gone to Saint-Cyr, he was an officer by the time World War I broke out. He was under the auspices of Philippe Pétain, who is someone who is very important in talking about the history of World War I and II and France, but he's a side person in the story of today about de Gaulle. But Pétain was already one of the most important generals of the French army and had been a great hero even in the war with Prussia. So he was not a young man, even by World War I. And he had taken de Gaulle under his wing, even though apparently a lot of the other officers didn't think de Gaulle would be the most brilliant soldier. He earned a reputation very early on, which you find out served him very well in the end with the rest of his life, for being very obstinate and for having a very strong opinion about military operations. He was obviously a brilliant soldier. And as Annie, you just mentioned, he started writing. He even started writing early, before he even finished Saint-Cyr, about military things. It was his base. He had this vision of what the army should be, of what a strong country should be. The patriotism and the military sort of blended together in his brain. He fought, of course, in World War I. Charles de Gaulle, was wounded 3 times in World War I. For those of you who know nothing about World War I, you have to try to imagine a third of the male population of France was killed in World War I. The miracle of the de Gaulle family is that all of the sons came out alive and came out without being handicapped, which is in and of itself just absolutely amazing. And Charles de Gaulle, who I guess we should just keep calling de Gaulle, he was wounded twice in the leg. Almost immediately, the first wound, he kept on going. He was in charge of a tank division. He was in charge of tanks and artillery, which became basically his specialty and his obsession. And he was serving, of course, on the Northeastern Front. But even with his wound, he continued to advance, and he was wounded a second time. He was wounded a third time. And then, unfortunately, even though he was starting to make some advances, there were very, very few companies that were able to do so. His regiment was decimated in 1916 in a major offensive, but he was captured along with a group of officers by the Germans. And of course, the treatment of officers as POWs was very different from the treatment of your basic foot soldier. And he was, by this time, of course, a lieutenant who even had been noticed by the Germans as being brave beyond normal, in a sense. I mean, he was actually threatened with being punished by his own hierarchy for disobeying orders, which, of course, in the military is absolutely a no-no, because when a superior officer gave him an order that he didn't agree with, it's hard to imagine, but he just went ahead and did what he wanted to do. The fact that he survived all of this and came out and didn't get actually court-martialed is actually amazing. And then he gets taken prisoner along with the rest of this particular regiment. And he wound up spending the last 2.5 years of World War I in POW camps in Germany. He tried 5 times to escape. This is like one of those movies, it's like I keep thinking of a Steve McQueen movie with the people escaping from World War II. He was transferred 10 times from one camp to another because they couldn't figure out what to do to keep him from trying to escape. And he wasn't released until the armistice was signed in 1918. The fact that he survived all of this and came out is already a miracle. But for him, it was the great shame of his life that he was taken prisoner. Like Annie, I didn't know that much about him before starting to read for the podcast. The conclusion I draw from this is that so much of what he did later on came out of this experience. First of all, the fighting and his ideas about what is a good, efficient army. And the second part being taken prisoner and the shame somehow of being taken prisoner and giving up the power to this enemy. It colored his vision of war and how war should be conducted and everything else for absolutely the rest of his life.
Yeah, and while he was a prisoner of war, he would actually write essays trying to crystallize all that he had learned and all that he thought his fellow officers should know about tanks, about the way to run an army, etc. And he started out just writing an essay and posting it on the wall. And then people were reading them, and so they distributed them, which, it's kind of crazy that he took it upon himself because, he was bored, obviously, and he wanted to do something useful with his time.
And he was also obsessed with the idea of building up tank divisions. It's very interesting. The question of where the future and the place of aviation in fighting in war. As at first, apparently, of course, coming out, he was born in 1890. This is just the beginning of using any kind of flying machine to fight in the war. But he is adamant that you need divisions of tanks that are advanced armory with artillery, not having tanks scattered here left and right, and that the old-fashioned way of fighting from the 1700s, 1800s was no longer possible to do. And people didn't listen to him at first. And this was one of the things that eventually caused a split between him and Pétain and some of the others, because he wanted a modern, armored army with a strong person leading everything.
Yes, he was definitely the young guy arriving into an army that was led by a lot of old people, what he saw as old people at the time. And he took advantage of his youth and his enthusiasm and his energy to just make a name for himself.
He made such a name for himself that, in fact, after the end of World War I, he was made, first of all, he was made a captain because you had to be a captain to be the head of a division in the army. And then he was offered an opportunity to work in the Ministry of the Defense and the Army, which is, of course, a desk job. He was really a man who wanted to be out in the fields fighting, but he took on the desk job because of his ability and his belief that he could help change the way the army was and the way the army was run. This is where he started to come up against the old ideas and the fact that there was a lot of resistance to changing the way the military was run and the things that were priorities in the military. He associated with a lot of different political groups. From what I understand, in the 1920s and 30s, which is, of course, a time of extremely complicated politics in France, extremely complicated, with lots of turmoil and lots of groups, both on extreme left and extreme right. He was someone who never specifically identified with any one political group. He hung out a lot with people that were more right-wing, sometimes associated with a group that was considered to be extremely right-wing, but he never actually belonged to any specific group or party. And he also listened at times to people that were members of the Socialist Party and people that were on the left. It's like he was able to take a little bit from everybody and sort of use it and turn it around in his brain to put out his ideas, because he wrote several books between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. And then it comes to the end of the 1930s, and you have the debacle of what happens with the rise of Hitler and Nazism in Germany, and a great disappointment on the part of de Gaulle when he sees that the man who at first had been his great hero, Philippe Pétain, agrees to the signing of what is called the Munich Accords. And the Munich Accords were basically an agreement that allowed Germany to take over parts of Czechoslovakia, which is no longer, of course, now even Czechoslovakia, parts of Poland. And everybody was warning the French that this was the beginning of German expansion into a war that would cover all of Europe. And de Gaulle tried to warn them, and he knew that this was going to happen. And none of these older officers wanted to listen to him. They said that the pact would make sure that France was kept out of the war, that it was not important whatever Germany was going to do with Poland, the eastern part of Europe. It didn't concern them. And of course, they were 100% wrong.
Yeah. When saber rattling starts, you better, even if you're not right under it, if it's not right over your head, yeah, pay attention.
So the Munich Accords were signed actually in 1938, in September of 1938. And it was at this point that de Gaulle broke definitively with Pétain. And he said, if you are a true patriot, you will do everything to keep France's sovereignty and not risk that the Germans will invade a second time and will take any territory that belongs to us. He was totally obsessed with the idea that France would have to be able to defend itself. And really and truly, very few people listened to him at this time.
Right. Yeah. And, it's like Pétain rolled over. It was really sad because he had gotten old and he had had a lot of fight in him in the First World War, and he didn't want to see the horrors of the First World War. Like you mentioned, lots of people died, and he thought it was better to appease than to fight. And that was a terrible decision.
Yes, he thought it was. In January of 1940, de Gaulle wrote a memo that he sent to 80 of the most important military and civilian authorities in the country, insisting that France had to have a specifically well-prepared army with divisions of tanks. The problem in France was that economically and industrially, after World War I, they were not as modern as some other countries had become. And it was very difficult for them to produce as much as, ironically, Germany, which was given a big boost by the help that it got losing the war after World War I. And so between his advanced thinking about what was necessary to have an army and the fact that many of the older officers in the army just said, we can't go through another war. It is only 20 years later. We cannot go through another war. He knew that France was not going to be prepared if and when Germany invaded. He was given a division of tanks. He actually started in May of 1940 with 364 tanks, but these were older tanks. These were not new models. These were the kinds of tanks that had been used for World War I. He was one of the bravest people to fight in the 40 days before the French army actually gave up. His division fought in several different battles. In one case, they actually made it 14 kilometers across into enemy lines. They lost a huge number of men, a huge number of tanks. 3 times he tried to get across the lines, and he was beaten back. Why? Because the Germans had air power, which the French did not, and because they had much more artillery, which the French did not. And at this point, I think de Gaulle probably already understood that the French would not be able to last much longer, and that everything that he had imagined was going to happen, which, of course, was an absolute nightmare.
There wasn't, in between the two wars, and you mentioned that Germany got a lot of help financially from the Americans because they wanted them to be able to rebuild and not, there was no point to letting their country destroyed to the level that it was. But they helped the Germans. They didn't help the French. The French were supposed to help themselves, I guess. And they didn't quite make it.
Yep. Yeah. They didn't quite make it. And it is very complicated, and it certainly is not my domain to understand all of the shenanigans of politics. The Brits were also left on their own to deal with rebuilding after World War I. But for some reason, they were able to rally and create a Royal Air Force in a much shorter amount of time than the French. This is one of the things I didn't know, and this was one of the things that amazed me. Before even the entrance of the Allies on the 21st of May, 1940, de Gaulle took it upon himself to go onto the radio, and it was the first of his many speeches appealing to the French to be courageous, to rally, to defend their country, even those who didn't have arms, who were just, normal citizens and farm people. He was so obsessed with the idea that the French needed to protect themselves and to have the morale to keep on going. And this idea of broadcasting on the radio to try and keep the morale up, of course, is something that became famous and that he did all through World War II.
Yeah, I think when I was hearing about this period of his life, it kind of reminded me of Zelensky today. Like, somebody who's just rallying the people and just saying we're not going to give up. They needed someone to do this. And honestly, most French people had given up. They were beaten and didn't have anything left in them. But he was able to rally enough to just stick a little bit of difficulties into the advance of the Germans. And it was better than nothing.
It certainly was better than nothing. It was just a few days after that he was finally made general. Me, coming to France, I've always considered de Gaulle to be a general. It's like he was born a general in my head. It's like I can't imagine him being a lieutenant colonel, a colonel, or anything like that. But it wasn't until actually May of 1940 when after he'd broadcasted this message and he was in charge of this division of tanks, that he was actually made a one-star general. And when he went to London to spend time rallying the French, and he was with Churchill, he was never more than a one-star general. He was not that high up on the scale of things, but it was like he was born to be a general. I really think that, there's something about him.
Yeah. Well, but he had prepared well. I mean, if you write essays constantly about the way the army should work and the grandeur of your country and whatever, I mean, he had been preparing his whole life for this.
He had been. He had indeed. In June of 1940, and 1940 is, of course, extremely important in all of this. In June of 1940, he was actually called to Paris, and he was made Undersecretary of War and National Defense under a new government, the government of a man named Paul Reynaud. And Paul Reynaud was a moderate who really aligned himself with de Gaulle in his thinking about defending the country. It was the beginning of de Gaulle's role as both a representative of the country and as a diplomat. Unfortunately for him, Reynaud was pushed out of office by Pétain and Laval and the group that became the head of the government in Vichy. If Reynaud had stayed in power, I think things would have been very different and he would have had much more of an army backing him up and fighting with him. But that did not happen. This is the first time de Gaulle, on June 9th of 1940, he was actually sent by this government, the Reynaud government, before Pétain pushes this guy out. He was sent on a mission to London to talk to Churchill to see how they could create a long relationship of fighting along with the British, because, of course, the British knew that they were going to have to fight themselves. And it was Churchill who allowed de Gaulle to make the first overseas broadcast from London, having been convinced by his determination and his charisma that this was the man to represent the French.
Right. And he probably thought, okay, it's not going to make much difference, but it can't hurt, so let's try it.
Right. I mean, there are lots of different versions. There are different films that show these scenes from the point of view of the British, from the point of view of the French. It's kind of hard to really know exactly how things went down at this particular moment. But it is true that at least at the beginning of World War II, after Germany declared war on both England and France, that Churchill really wanted to have de Gaulle next to him, and they were hoping to work together all through World War II. What wound up becoming World War II. Churchill recognized de Gaulle as the representative of the Free French forces and that he was the proxy for an alternative government. The problem was that once Reynaud was pushed out and Pétain became the leader of the French government that signed an armistice with the Germans and created a government in the town of Vichy, which of course is why it's called the Vichy government, that is, none of the other Western countries that were occupied by the Germans, and not England and not the United States, wanted to recognize the few exiled military and statesmen that joined de Gaulle in London as an alternative official government. This was one of the worst things that happened in World War II, is that for reasons that I really find very complex, it's hard to understand completely, but they could have recognized them as a government in exile, but they did not.
Right? Because the problem is they hadn't been elected to nothing. Like, did Pétain get elected to anything? I don't think so either. So, it was just a complicated thing. And perhaps there was a bit of a feeling that this de Gaulle guy was too big for his breeches and might take over the world or might not play nice with kind of democratic institutions. Who knows?
It's hard to understand why they thought that. What is true is that he had pretensions of being the leader of France. That is for sure. Hey, I mean, he made no bones about that. He pleaded with Churchill, and he then eventually pleaded with Roosevelt and the Americans to disown the Vichy government completely and to consider that his group, including diplomats who were all in exile, were the official French government, and they refused.
That's what caused a lot of problems between de Gaulle and Churchill and Roosevelt. Yeah.
For whatever reasons, Churchill had a much clearer understanding of who de Gaulle was, and I've read a few articles where Churchill talks about him. He understood de Gaulle. He was at times aggravated with him. He was at times angry with him. He was at times that he did not help him. But he did really understand de Gaulle and what he wanted and the position he had. Whereas what apparently was the case was that Roosevelt did not like him, did not trust him. And even though de Gaulle, all he wrote about was, he didn't write about being an imperialist. He wrote about being a strong leader for his country. Roosevelt mistrusted him enormously. It seems like it's far deeper and more complicated than I can imagine at this point,
Pheromones.
Yeah, it's very much.
Bad pheromones.
It's very bad. I mean, it was very bad. I read 2 articles where they literally talk about how much Roosevelt detested him, and yet he had no specific reason to. I mean, it's very, very strange. What I didn't know was that the Vichy government, after he started de Gaulle's activities, first in London and then eventually going to Algeria, broadcasting, having soldiers in exile, having diplomats in exile, the Vichy government condemned him to death as a traitor.
Wow.
In contumace, meaning that, of course, he wasn't there. But I had no idea that it actually happened. They said he was a traitor to the country and that if he ever came back into France, he would be executed.
That's insane.
It's insane when you think about it. So we have the war. The war lasts basically between 1940 until August of 1944. Then there were skirmishes until the treaties are signed in May of 1945. All this time, de Gaulle is trying desperately to get the English and then the Americans to work with him. And instead, what happens is that they make plans and exclude him.
Right. He wasn't made aware of most things that the Americans and English were planning.
And largely, if I understand correctly, because Roosevelt did not want him to be privy to these plans. He was not aware that they were going to come up from North Africa and invade from the south of France and into Italy. He was not told about the specific dates for the invasion in Normandy. He was invited to take his soldiers and join some of the British forces and go along with them once these things were put into motion. But he kept insisting and kept writing and saying, I want to make decisions. I want to be included in the decision making. And at what point he was in Algeria and Churchill finally backed him and said, okay, we're talking about his country. We have to include him in the meetings where we make these decisions and talk about it. And so they had him come to Algeria and join in the meetings, but they brought someone else in. So they had to do a power sharing. And de Gaulle basically said, me or nobody. So this was, of course, partly his attitude as well. And if he hadn't done the one thing that he is really famous for at this point for World War II, which was create the Committee of National Resistance inside the country of France, he probably would not have even been included in what he was included in by the British and the Americans. What he did do It was try to find a way to rally the people inside the country. So he created this Committee of National Resistance of the Interior, basically. And this is where the man that we talked about, Jean Moulin, was brought in because he was flown to London to meet him. And de Gaulle said, look, we have to see if we can get all of these different groups to join together and create some kind of cohesive whole. Just like his attitude towards the army, if you don't have a resistance that has a unified front and has a unified plan, nothing is ever going to work.
So what de Gaulle was worried about is that the English and the Americans, at this point, I should say, at this point, de Gaulle believed that the Allies were going to prevail. He wasn't worried about that. But what he worried about is that he thought the British and the Americans were going to divide up Europe without consulting anybody. The way they divided up the Middle East without consulting anybody, by the way. And that's what he fought tooth and nail. He said, Europeans should be involved in deciding what happens to Italy, what happens to Poland. We must be involved. And he was met with a lot of incredulity from the powerful forces. The money all came from the US. And the English, I think because they spoke the same language, I forgot to do this, but I intended to try and listen to some of de Gaulle speaking English. His English was probably not that great.
It wasn't very good, no.
Right. And so, it's really hard to fight for your ideas in a second language. You can't really say things the way you would like to. Anyway, so that was his concern, is we're being left out of everything at this point, and this could end up very badly.
Yes. And I know that was one of the biggest fears. I put down 2 quotes at some point when Churchill really gets angry with him and basically says, you aren't France, because, he's annoyed with him for being so pretentious. And he says, you're fighting for France, but you are not France. And de Gaulle's response was, I am speaking for France. I represent free France. The 2 different visions of what was actually happening. And you're absolutely right, because apparently, mostly on the part of Roosevelt, there was this idea that when they won the war and the war was over, that all these countries that had basically submitted to the Germans and who had basically given up would be taken over and dealt with in a different kind of way, including part of France.
Well, yeah, they wanted vassal states. They wanted to be able to install whoever they wanted to lead those countries, and all praise to the liberators, which even de Gaulle did a lot, So there you have it.
Yeah. When it came to the invasion of Normandy, I can just imagine the fury that he had to realize that he hadn't been consulted and that his soldiers were not included, because there were just a few.
There were a few, but very few. There were a few that were fighting with the English and had stayed with the English, yeah.
So what happened, though, was that once they got to the beaches of Normandy, he convinced Churchill and General Montgomery, who, of course, was the head of the British Army, and Montgomery apparently had a much better relationship with him than almost anybody else. It was very interesting. He also actually got along with Eisenhower, which is also very interesting. But he had not been with them on the beaches, but he was there the second they were off the beaches into Normandy, and he convinced Montgomery to let him speak on the radio from Bayeux. And so in 1944, in June, after they did that, this was the first time he got on the radio and basically said, we have saved the country. Well, they were a long way from saving the country, and of course, a lot of it was totally demolished anyway. But the fact that he was there speaking in French on the radio, he was right. It gave the people of France hope.
Right, because you have to understand what really happened during the D-Day is that, of course, they bombed some German positions and whatever, but it's mostly French villages, farmhouses that got blown up into smithereens. And it wasn't the Germans doing it, it was the Allies doing it. And so at this point, what do you say to the French people? And you had, on the one hand, you had Pétain saying, oh my God, they are bombing us. they are the real enemies. We would have done better if we had accepted the Germans. And you have de Gaulle saying, listen, it has to be this way. We have to get rid of the Germans somehow, and we have to suffer through this. But I understand the people on the ground, like, how would you see it if it was happening to you? It's really hard.
It's very complicated. And that is one of the reasons why those speeches that he gave were so incredibly important. He also, by the way, agreed, I did read this, that he did understand and agree as a pure military man, the destruction of the French fleet. He understood that it was necessary, that if they couldn't move the fleet out, he said, if I had been in charge and it had been my decision, I would have done the same thing.
Well, except he got mad about the big, I can't remember the name of the big ship in
Kabir.
Yeah, there was a big ship in Algeria that they sunk, and he was like, you didn't have to do that.
Right. Anyway, it was from this point on, in spite of all of the rest of what had to continue in terms of the battles, that de Gaulle positioned himself by force of his stubbornness, his insistence, basically, really, that he was publicly visible as the Allies approached Paris from Normandy. To me, it is unbelievable that he managed to do that. He actually positioned himself so that he was physically visible at that time.
Right. They just wanted the Americans and the British. That's it. That's it. That's the people we want to see. The other people, F off.
And sure enough, when, of course, Roosevelt, especially Roosevelt, but Roosevelt and Churchill, they said, we are the ones who are pushing back the Germans. We are the ones.
Which they were.
And he said, no. General Leclerc, who was, of course, the major other general, French general who had fought with the British. And he said, no, we are going to be there when you arrive in Paris to show the French people that there is a French military that is still standing, that there is a representation of the French that is not the Vichy government that is coming in. And of course, that is exactly what happened. The Yiddish word chutzpah. I mean, chutzpah, if you push far enough and you are sure enough of yourself, you can maybe get away with something. And that is actually what I think he did,
Yeah. And after the war, we're not quite done with the war, but.
And after the war, well, of course, the war goes on for another 9 months, really. But he is put in charge of the provisional government. Bless the man, right? I mean, this is,
He felt like there had to be somebody French who could represent, like who could be the figurehead.
He wanted to make sure there was, number one, no civil war, because there was a chance in France, of course, of a huge, terrible civil war between those who complied with the Vichy government and those who suffered the Vichy government and the Germans.
Which is most people complied. Most French people complied. They were not that brave. They just decided it was easier to get along and shut up and get along, which is what happens when you have a big, scary leadership kind of person in a country. Like, it's hard to resist.
And there were those, of course, who collaborated.
Even worse, yeah.
He knew between the resistant groups, between the collaborators, between those people who basically just, laid down and let the world pass over them. He knew that there was going to be a huge amount of tension. There was a lot of political tension. There was a lot of hatred and resentment. There was the beginning of retribution in 1945 and 1946. There were incidents of retribution. And basically what he did was he put a stop to that. And he said, no, we have to have national unity. And at least at first, forget about who did what. We have to look forward. We have to create a new government. And that was when he began his political career, basically creating the provisional government.
Yes, and one thing we should point out is that during this whole time, one of the places that he drew the most power from and the most strength from was the French Empire, such as it was. France had colonies in Africa, and these places were very willing to work with him, to send troops, to work with him, to help the mainland, which most of them had never set foot on. It's incredible that they did this. And throughout this whole war, de Gaulle spent a lot of time living in Algeria, as a matter of fact, because it was the biggest colony. My parents lived in Algeria at the time, and they were very young, both of them. But they remembered the Americans coming to take over in their village, and they didn't seem to mind. The kids were given chewing gum, which they had never had. My mom remembered the chewing gum. But the French Empire and the battalions of black soldiers who fought for France were incredible. It kind of gave him a lot of, he was like, we're not alone. We're not alone in this fight. It's not lost because we have the colonies, and it made sense.
It made sense, but of course, the irony of all this is, of course, not only was he given the charge of creating a provisional government from 1944 to 1946, but he went on to create his own political party called the Rassemblement du Peuple Français. I'll leave you to translate that.
The Assembly of the French People.
The Assembly of French People, I guess.
We all called it le RPR forever.
Which was basically a center-right party. And he helped create a new republic in France. Each time there's basically a modification of the rules of the government and the constitution. So he was part of the creation of what's called the Fifth Republic. And of all things, he wound up becoming president of France from 1959 to 1969. The destiny of this man who started out fighting against the archaism of the troops and the material in World War I, who never imagined himself as a politician, but as a military man, and who actually wound up being the hero in the eyes of the French people. And I would prefer that you talk about him even in his political career and his government, because I know so little about it,
One of the things that complicated a lot of things during World War II is communism, because there were a lot of communist groups in France. It was a major political party in France. It was huge. I mean, at one point, they had almost 50% of the votes. And for obvious reasons, the Americans didn't want the communists to win elections. And that's one of the things that kind of swayed them to support de Gaulle. At first, they said, well, we don't have a choice. We have to support Pétain because otherwise it's the communists. But then de Gaulle kind of came up as another possibility. And it took a long time for him to establish himself. But there were massive tensions. And de Gaulle was no communist, but he worked with some of them. When he was the president, he had communists in his cabinet, usually at, minor positions. But, they were elected. If you have a political party that earns 30% of the vote, you got to put them somewhere. That's just how it is. We're not going to go into all of this after-war thing, but I just would like to say that because I am the daughter of Pieds-Noirs, so that's the French people who colonized Algeria and lived in Algeria for a few generations, and then came back to France when de Gaulle decided to return Algeria to its own devices. My parents, who were not political at all, had gone to hear him give a famous speech in 1962 where tensions were very, very high. The Algerian war had been going on for a while already, a couple of years. And they went to hear him, and he said, "Je vous ai compris." That's the quote that my dad used to repeat all the time. And he took it to mean, we understand that you want to stay in Algeria, and we're going to fight for you. And he did exactly the opposite. And this is something that de Gaulle was famous for. He was able to give a speech where at the end of it, you weren't sure if he was going to go right or if he was going to go left. And that's one of the things that really annoyed the Americans about him, because besides the language difficulties, he was also very slick. Okay, he was a slick politician, and he fooled a lot of people, even native speakers. As the daughter of people, obviously, my parents did not like him. Most Pieds-Noirs did not like Charles de Gaulle or the political party that he founded afterwards. And he wasn't the perfect person. He had a lot of flaws, but you have to give it to him. He was able to rally French people who were about to completely give up.
Yeah.
Because they had been beaten into a pulp in the First World War.
Right.
And the Second World War, you make another kid and you're happy your husband's back from the war. You make another kid. Now he's 20 and there's another war.
Yep.
Like, what would they do to you? So I was not raised in we love de Gaulle kind of situation.
But I still have to say, he was a very important character in French history. I certainly agree with you. I think that if there's anybody who colored and influenced everything between World War I and basically the 1980s, because of course there's the aftermath of the party he founded and everything else. And there are still politicians who call themselves Gaullists, and
Oh, yeah.
you could wonder what that means sometimes, but there they are. But I mean, here was this man. I quoted him at the end because I think it's the perfect epitaph for him. He said, "The end of hope is the beginning of death." And I think that that's actually tells you everything about him. He never gave up hoping. He never gave up believing that if you convince people to look forward, to hang in there, to rally, that things will eventually get better. I mean, that was the way he was as a military leader. And I think that's probably the way he was in terms of his broadcasting during World War II. The complications and of course, part of his destiny was, what is the role of France in the world? There's a whole other...
Yeah, that's a big one.
Oh, boy, there's a big bag of beans there,
So he was the president of France. Another major achievement is that he instituted the Fifth Republic, which in France, when you have a new republic, when you change the constitution in significant ways, you just bring about a new version of that constitution. And he wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't anybody but he worked on a system that he thought would work better. And that has actually been in place since he was in power. So it's been in place now for many years. It seems to have served the country well. It's far from perfect, but it seems to have worked for a long time. France has become a bit more stable politically. They still fight, but they fight.
They fight. The French like to fight politically. Yeah.
But at the end of his career, at the end of his life as well, in 1969, he just lost an election and he quit. He just left. And he told them, at noon today, I'm done. And he left, picked up his family and went to Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, where he had a house where he had been on and off for a long time. And he never went back to Paris, except, I think, for the wedding of one of his nieces. But he just didn't go back. But of course, he didn't live that much longer.
He only lived less than a year.
Yes, he lived for another year and he died of an aneurysm, which is what had killed his brother and his father as well. So modern medicine would have probably avoided him that fate, although perhaps it was a serious enough aneurysm that there's not anything that they could have done about it. At any rate, he was an amazing statesman. He's right up there with people like Napoleon and people like that, French people that are famous enough to be talked about outside of France. I think he did some good and he did some bad.
But he certainly was very important in the history of France for almost 100 years.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Elyse. All week long, I've been listening to that book about Charles de Gaulle. There are some assignments that are very fun. This one was arduous. I had to really concentrate on what the heck was happening. So much was happening.
Yeah, well, let's face it. A lot happened in the world in that time.
Yes, and in the end, I decided I'm going to avoid the details and just go to the general stuff. Thank you so much, Elyse.
You're quite welcome.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank all my patrons for giving back and supporting the show. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing that. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. That's Patreon. Join us, no spaces or dashes. And a special shout out this week to my new Join Us in France champion, Melissa Pope. And thank you, Beth and Blake Hall, for editing your membership up as well. Would you join them too? You can do it for as little as $3 a month if you want the ad-free version of the episodes. But if you can afford it and you want more of the stuff, I would love to have you pledge more so you can have access to more of the rewards, including Zoom time with Annie that we had this weekend and is always a lot of fun. And to support Elyse, of course, who does such a great job, go to patreon.com/ElyseArt. ELYSART. I need to keep this short this week, so let's go directly to December 31st, 2025, New Year's festivities in Paris. This is a quick update from Paris about the New Year's Eve celebrations on the Champs-Élysées and why they're going to look a little bit different this year. For the past few years, the city has offered a full evening program on December 31st, including a big public concert right on the avenue. But for New Year's Eve 2025, that concert has been cancelled. The fireworks at midnight will still happen, but there will be no live musical event before that. The reason is simple: security concerns. According to the Paris police, last year's festivities, which brought more than 1 million people into the Champs-Élysées area, created several frightening crowd movements. One police commissioner even said that they had more scares in 2 hours on New Year's Eve than during the 3 full weeks of the Olympic Games. That gives you a sense of the pressure they're under. Because of that, the police prefecture asked the concert be dropped, and the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, agreed. So instead of a live event, France 2 will broadcast a pre-recorded concert that was filmed a few days ago, actually, at the Place de la Concorde, complete with paid extras standing in for the crowd. Some Parisians shrug it off. Many locals say they avoid the Champs-Élysées on New Year's Eve anyway because of the crowds. I certainly do personally. But tourists may find the night a little bit less festive than expected. Still, the big show remains. The fireworks at midnight are going ahead exactly as planned. And if you're in Paris during the holidays, the Champs-Élysées lights are still dazzling every night through January 4th. They turn on at 5 p.m. and switch off at midnight on weekdays and 1 a.m. on weekends, except for Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve when they stay on until morning. So it's going to be fewer crowds, no live concerts, but the traditional fireworks and holiday sparkle are still very much happening at the Most Avenue in France. And when it comes to Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, those are very much family events in France. If you are in Paris at this time, make sure to reserve your meals and be prepared to pay extra for special meals. And this is true also of New Year's Eve. If you don't want to go to the fireworks, but you'd like something special, look around if you're already in Paris, or look on the Fork, the app for reserving meals, and look for special New Year's Eve dinners. They cost more, but they are usually a lot of fun. My thanks to podcast editors Anne and Christian Codovan, who produced the transcripts and the audio. Next week on the podcast, an episode about 40 visits to France with Janice Chan. How's that for a long-term love and appreciation for France from our friend Janice from Canada? Janice is a lot of fun to chat with. You'll love our conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2025 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.